Okay, excellent. My apologies. I'm having trouble with my camera. So we're talking about flying squirrels in the national park on San Juan Island, and we can actually move on to the next slide. There's a lovely illustration of flying squirrels and some of the associated species there. So this is the northern flying squirrel, and you can see the range distribution of this critter. It's a small nocturnal omnivorous mammal that obviously doesn't actually fly, but glides between trees. And there are 3 species of the genus Glaucomys, but all of them are North American. And the northern flying squirrel range extends mostly across Canada, but dips down a little bit into this area here. And we wanted to take a closer look at what they're doing on San Juan Island. They had only been confirmed by incidental detections on San Juan, mostly when someone's cat would bring one in. We can move to the next slide. On the other hand, occasionally they show up on camera traps, which is that bright picture at the bottom there. And some students from one of the local schools actually found them inhabiting bird boxes as well. They also will come into the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, which is the juvenile in the hand there. But we wanted to know a bit more about what they're doing on San Juan and what this population is. There are 3 species of northern flying, or 3 species of Glaucomys, a flying squirrel, one of which has sometimes gotten into the pet trade, I think mostly the illegitimate pet trade. But one of the questions about these flying squirrels is, are they actually native to San Juan Island? Are these, in fact, northern flying squirrels, or are they introduced and released pets? Next slide, please. So we had received specimens from primarily catkills, occasionally window strikes, and you can see a little bit of the distribution of those. They don't show up on any of the other islands in the San Juans, just on San Juan Island. And we started initially looking to confirm some of their behavior and distribution by setting up trail cameras. This is actually some years ago where we had baited trail cameras in a Garry Oak tree to see if the squirrels would come and take those acorns. And we did, in fact, get a picture there. And then more recently, we started working with the national park to get a better sense of what these squirrels are doing in the area that's sort of an oak community next to a Douglas fir forest that has been a site of restoration in the Mount Young section of English Camp part of the National Historical Park on San Juan Island. Next slide, please. Oh, so that's showing us focusing in on that study area there. Next slide. And you can see the context here. There's on Mount Young itself, there's an area that has been opened up more with a more open canopy, but it's surrounded by a great deal of coniferous forests. And all of the reports that we have from people on San Juan of flying squirrels are primarily in this sort of ridge area. So those labels are what people on San Juan refer to as mountains. They're ridges. So Katy Mountain, Mitchell Hill, and Mount Young. And this is the area that we have reports of flying squirrels from on San Juan Island. So we wanted to focus in on Mount Young and see if we could figure out what the flying squirrels were doing there. Next slide. This is a little bit of the habitat there. You can see large old oaks, but also quite old and well-established Douglas firs. This is us taking a look around these oaks looking for seedlings. Next slide. This is a community that also has other rare and significant species. My colleague Christian will talk about the sharp-tailed snakes. It also has the only oak-dependent species that we have here in the San Juans, which is the prettiest dusky wing, a skipper. And you can see a mating pair there. So it's a significant habitat. Figuring out how different creatures use it and what's important in this habitat to those creatures is important to the park's management. And so we were happy to help investigate both flying squirrels and sharp-tailed snakes. Next slide. These are the acorns that fall under those oaks. And one of the reasons that we thought this area might be important for those flying squirrels as little omnivores that like to eat nuts and also as a way of us detecting flying squirrels by looking at herbivory on acorns. They're not the only thing that interacts with acorns, though. Next slide, please. So we took a look at the acorns to see if we could figure out who was eating them, burying them. One of the reasons we're interested in flying squirrels is that San Juan Island does not have any other native squirrel species, and it no longer has Steller's jays. And so we were curious about which species might be planting acorns. Garry Oaks have non-dormant acorns. Once they hit the ground and get wet, they start to sprout. And if they're not buried, that reduces their likelihood of survival. And also, if they're not being distributed, that oak grove doesn't grow. So this was a survey looking for evidence of herbivory on acorns, but also burying. An area where we saw evidence of small mammals eating these acorns or caching them, are in pink there. And then most of the acorns that we found herbivory on had been eaten by deer, by Columbia black-tailed deer. Next slide, please. Here the critters are that might be eating acorns in this landscape. The deer, they crunch those acorns up. Generally, they're not going to survive being eaten by a deer. Band-tailed pigeons, they are really good at scattering acorns out of trees, but they don't distribute them very far. They do swallow them whole, and so there is some possibility of a pigeon then being predated on or dying somewhere else and distributing the acorn, but they're not very good distributors, whereas the northern flying squirrels are known to cache food. And depending on whether they're doing ground caching or tree caching, they can actually increase the survival of these acorns even while they're consuming them. Next slide. So one of the ways we tried to get at whether the flying squirrels were using this area, because we weren't seeing them very often on camera traps, we took a look. We'd been recording bats at Mount Young for a few years at this point, and we found that some of the calls that were showing up on our bat detectors were not consistent with bats at all. So we used the program Kaleidoscope to develop a classifier that would pull out non-bat ultrasonic calls, and took a look at when these showed up on the assumption that at least some of these would be flying squirrels. We then compared them to recordings of flying squirrels from other parts of the country, and to reports of calls by Peromyscus, the deer mice. At this point, we get a lot of non-bat ultrasonic calls showing up on those bat recorders. Very few of them are consistent with being Peromyscus. Some of them, though, we did compare them to the upper registers of bird calls in order to sort of filter that out. But we're setting up a new recorder that'll allow us to do the full range, so to do non-ultrasonic audible calls, so that we can make sure that what we're looking at isn't in fact just birds with a very high pitch. But you can see that most of the activity is in August and September. And it's interesting that it sort of slacked off after that, because the acorns are ripening closer to October. So it didn't look, based on this, that we were seeing the ultrasonic calls being consistent with most of the attraction for flying squirrels being acorns. So that was an interesting, we're still trying to learn more about that. Ultrasonic monitoring of flying squirrels generally is more effective than either trapping or camera trapping, but we still need to probably get a little bit finer of a classifier, so we're pulling out specifically squirrels each time. Next slide. But one of the big questions is, why are there flying squirrels on San Juan, not on the other islands? And why is it just flying squirrels when there's all these other potential species of squirrels in the area? So the San Juans have 3 different species of squirrels, broadly speaking. So Douglas squirrels, which in the San Juans are confined to Orcas; Townsend's chipmunks, which in the San Juans are confined to Lopez; and these northern flying squirrels on San Juan, which don't occur on the other islands. There's also a couple species of non-native squirrel in the islands. So did they get here by people bringing them? Did they get here right after the glaciers receded, hopping? How did they get into the islands? And this is something we hoped to be able to get at a little bit with some genetic data. Next slide, please. One of the questions, one of the most likely ways that the squirrels got to the islands was by rafting on material coming out of the rivers. And you can see there's a great deal of flow from the Fraser, and up in that part of the mainland, there are all three of the species that show up in the islands. But there's also some flow out of the Skagit. And so the question we wanted to get at is, did the flying squirrels come, if they came naturally, did they come from the Fraser outflow, rafting on material from there, or from the Skagit, or in some other fashion? Next slide. So we had specimens that people had donated from cat kills, or that had been collected when flying squirrels were in care at the Wildlife Rehab Center on San Juan. And we were able to get a good genetic sequence of the mitochondrial control region for 8 of these, 6 of them from San Juan Island, and 2 from Skagit County, from Campbell Lake, and from another area of Skagit County. 2 of them were genetically identical, the 2 from Egg Lake. The rest of them were all a little bit different. We then used GenBank to look for similar sequences for the control region to see if we could figure out what the most closely related populations to these on San Juan were. Next slide. So these are the areas that they were most closely related to. You can see this is primarily in BC and Alaska, with very few in Washington state. I also took a look and compared them to every sequence available from Washington state, just to see if that gave me different results. Those results are in the next slide, and I'll show you that in fact they did not. So the squirrels from San Juan Island clustered together, and they clustered separately from the ones from Skagit County, and they were more closely related to squirrels from BC and Alaska. When I included all of this tree doesn't show it because it would have been very large, but when I included all of the sequences available from Washington state, I got the same kind of clustering. So it looks like the squirrels on San Juan have been there for long enough to be genetically isolated, that they're more closely related to each other than to any of the other squirrels, and that when you compare them to the closest available data from Skagit County, it doesn't look like they came directly from the neighboring mainland from Skagit County, but more likely came down, rafting down the Fraser. That suggests that they've been here on San Juan Island for a very long time, and that they were unlikely to have brought in by people. Also, they're definitely not southern flying squirrels, so they're not part of an escaped pet trade. Next slide, please. There's the 3 different species of flying squirrel, and how sort of the context in terms of the flying squirrels on San Juan and their closest relatives, suggesting a potential route for them to have come here into the islands. I think that's it, but let's see if is there one more slide? Thank you so much, and to my colleagues who helped with this. And I apologize that you couldn't see my handy gesticulation while I was presenting, but I'm glad that you could hear me.
Thanks. I have some time for a question. Roger Christopherson, you started a question in the type, but it didn't finish it. Could they have?
Could they have hitchhiked on boats? It seems to us that if they had, so first of all, given the timing, how long they've been in the, so we only know for sure that they've been reported in the islands from either I think the 90s. There may be some reports earlier from the 70s. When there wasn't as much boat travel. They're nocturnal, and when people do end up with them in their houses, they tend to know. So while they're not noisy exactly, they're kind of active at night. So it seems unlikely. It also seems that if they were to come in by boat, it probably would have been from the immediate neighboring mainland, and they are not very closely related either to squirrels in Skagit County or to the immediate BC mainland. And so it is possible, but based on the genetics, we think it's unlikely.
Great, thank you for that.